Hello, I'm Dave Doyle, and welcome to the session on datum comparisons, looking at the North American datum of 1983 and the World Geodetic System 1984. The issue of how these two systems relate to one another, either do or don't, has come up thousands of times since both datums were developed back in the mid-80s. And there's a lot of misconception about how they relate to one another. So I want to take some time today in this presentation, being sponsored by the Geospatial Users Group and the Florida Surveying and Mapping Society, to hopefully dispel some of the issues about the relationship of NAD83 and WGS84. So the question that has been posed to me many times by users of geospatial data is NAD83 and WGS84, are they the same? Well, it's kind of a funny answer, but the answer is yes and no. It all depends upon what you're looking for. So first of all, there is a Federal Register notice that was published in 1995 that specifically states that NAD83 and WGS84, although they typoed it, that's not a typo in mine, that's a typo in the Federal Register notice, that they can be considered to be identical for mapping and charting applications at a scale of approximately 1 to 5,000. So that means the positional uncertainty of anything within a map or chart would be in the range of about 4 meters. Well, this was done for a whole range of reasons, but primarily so that mariners and airline pilots would not have to worry about datum differences. You just give them a chart. They may be getting some data that would say their GPS or GNSS unit is working in WGS84, but they would have a map that would be in NAD83. Can they consider them to be the same? And the point is, absolutely, for products and services that are at that level, they can be considered to be absolutely identical. Another aspect of this is the size and shape of the Earth that's being used. Now, this is referred to as a reference ellipse in geodesy. For NAD83, the reference ellipsoid that is used is called Geodetic Reference System 1980. For WGS84, and this is where things get a little tricky, the name of the ellipsoid is the same as the name of the datum, WGS84. So when I say NAD83, I'm not saying GRS80, but it's defined. That is, since that is the reference ellipsoid that's used for NAD83, it's defined when I say I'm using the North American datum of 1983. When somebody says WGS84, I have to ask, are you talking about the reference ellipse or are you talking about the datum? These are two different things. And that's important, and I'm going to highlight that in just a few minutes. Positional differences, that is, the position you would determine on the ground between the two datums, can easily be in the range of 1.5 to 2 meters or more, depending upon how you're approaching your positioning. And with the publication of the new datums from the United States, the new North American terrestrial reference frame of 2022, hopefully to come out in 2025, all of these issues pretty much go away. So what we're dealing with now is information that is already out there in the arena, and you have to deal with it on a contemporary basis. So let's look at a geodetic datum. Now, I'm not going to get into this in any great depth. There's already a session that's provided by the Florida Surveying and Mapping Society on geodetic surfaces. I would encourage you to go watch that one. But what I want to highlight here that is really important is this specific issue right here, and that is the realization. If I have a datum, if I have information in a datum, then I must have some way to access it. That is, to realize it. There's got to be some source for that particular datum from some authoritative institution that is the institution that's providing that datum. So the datum itself, the datum definition, yeah, it's just a set of of parameters that define how we're going to describe the size and shape of the Earth or a height system, whichever datum we're looking at. But this is the important part. I have to have some kind of realization. And that plays an important role in the description of the relationship of NAD83 and WGS84. So, the basic datum, the 8 basic constants of a datum. Now, there are many more constants that go into a datum, but there's these 8 basics. 3 define the orientation, the location of the origin. 3 specify the orientation. And 2 specify the size and shape of the Earth. Remember, that's referred to as the reference ellipse. So when I say I have a datum, NAD83, or I have the datum, WGS84, it's these 8 constants, only 2 of which are the reference ellipse. So in NAD83, 2 are GRS80. In the WGS84 datum, 2 are the WGS84 ellipse. That's where things start to sound confusing. The really big issue here are these 6, the origin and the orientation. When originally defined, NAD83 and WGS84, when they were originally defined back in the early 80s, they both used the same origin. And that origin was Earth Geocenter. Now, given the technology that was available to us circa late 1970s right up to the early 80s, our understanding of the location of Earth Geocenter was plus or minus roughly about 2 meters. And that's just fine. So that means that the two datums were coincidental with each other within the context of their internal capability to define Earth Geocenter, or roughly about 2 meters. Right? Over time, what's happened is that there have been monumental changes on the integrity, the internal integrity of the North American datum of 1983. The National Geodetic Survey, over a period of some years, reobserved the entire United States and all of its territories with high accuracy GPS, referenced as the HARNS, the High Accuracy Reference Network, which led to improvements in the internal components of NAD83. The development of CORES, continuously operating reference stations, have all enhanced the NAD83. So today, as of the taping of this presentation in November of 2021, the North American datum of 1983 has an uncertainty, at least in conterminous US, from Maine to California at the area of about 1 centimeter. But the datum is biased or offset to our best knowledge of Earth Geocenter in the area of about 1.5 to 2 meters. Because in the intervening 40 plus years since we began developing these techniques, various applications looking at Earth orientation parameters have evolved and have contributed to our global understanding of where Earth Geocenter is. So today, using technologies that are available that I'll point out in just a few minutes, we now know the location of Earth Geocenter to typically better than about 2 centimeters, but the national datum for the United States, NAD83, is still fixed to our original definition from the 1980s, which is biased by about 1.5 meters to 2 meters. On the other hand, the U.S. Defense Department has made great strides in periodically changing WGS84 to be more consistent with these updated definitions in Earth Geocenter. The problem is there really hasn't been much in the way of them marketing that this has happened. So constantly what you find are users, whether they're using GNSS equipment or perhaps they're using a GIS, they will say, oh, all of my data is in WGS84, when there have been 7 different iterations of WGS84. And now, when everybody is trying to reach at the centimeter level, it's particularly difficult to understand how you can achieve that without having the realization provided by an institution like NGS. So I'm going to highlight a bit more of this in the next couple of minutes here. So first, understanding that a datum, when I say a datum, it has these basic 8 constants, and the ellipsoid is only 2 components of that. And I'll just highlight that very quickly here. Here you see an example of a reference ellipse. It's defined, it's 2 major properties, little a, or the semi-major axis, little b, or the semi-minor axis, and then this value a minus b divided by a gives us the flattening of this surface. So all horizontal, or now geometric datum as we refer to them, all horizontal geometric datums are defined relative to some size and shape of the Earth. And so we're going to take a closer look at that particular issue. So the Geodetic Reference System 1980, this is the reference ellipse used not only by the United States for N883, but many other countries around the world. So it is not unique to North America, to the United States and Canada. Right? It is not the datum, it is the reference ellipse. And its size and shape. It was originally defined by the IUGG, the International Union of Geodesy and Geophysics, in a resolution in 1979. There's a document that you can go and actually look at this. So if I go, there you can see the document. I just put it up there. You can use the URL. You can go work through it if you like to read the documentation about GRS80. So it has history that goes back to 1979. Whereas WGS84, it was first published in 1987. So that's 8 years later. Now I want to point out the configuration of the datum. The ellipse, excuse me, the reference ellipse. So Geodetic Reference System 1980, remember I talked about little a and the flattening. Right? So little a, 6,378,137 meters. If we look at the description of WGS84, 6,378,137, they're identical. So far, that's absolutely, totally correct and equal. Where they differ is a slight variation in the flattening component. 2 in the 6th decimal place of the flattening. Well, 2 in the 6th decimal place of the flattening of the reference ellipse, this is sub-millimeter over continental scales. So for all intents and purposes, you can consider that the reference ellipsoids that are being used are totally identical. They're mathematically identical. And there is a documentation that defines WGS84. Now, during my time at the National Geodetic Survey, when I was working on this and collaborating with lots of surveyors, I would hear this issue of WGS84 come up many, many times. And I would ask them, okay, you have coordinates in WGS84. Do you have the documentation for WGS84? And invariably, what I would find is they would say, no, I've never seen it. And I've talked to surveyors and engineers and GIS people who've never seen this documentation, yet it's easily available out there. So here's the URL. I'll just show you here very quickly that this is the documentation from the Defense Mapping Agency that defines the original World Geodetic System of 1984. So I put that out there just to make sure that you understand that WGS84, even though it's dated 84, was not released until 1987. Just as NAD83, North American Datum of 1983, was not officially released till 1986. So NAD83 and WGS84 were never defined together. They were defined by 2 entirely different federal geodetic institutions. But I'll make sure you've got a highlight for the URL here. That agency, the Defense Mapping Agency, is now the National Geospatial Intelligence Agency, and a little bit later on I'm going to show you an update on that publication. So if we look at the datum definitions. Now we're talking about how the datums were actually derived and defined. If we look at the North American datum of 1983, it was primarily a collaborative effort between the U.S. National Geodetic Survey and Geodetic Survey Canada. It used over 260,000 individual geodetic control points, triangulation and traverse. It also used a tremendous amount of new technology. Transit Doppler, the satellite system that preceded GPS, and very long baseline interferometries in North America, across the Caribbean and the Pacific. So this was the first datum, first civilian datum anywhere in the world to use space-based applications, especially satellite-based applications, to determine a datum. And it was the first civilian datum anywhere in the world to have its origin of coordinates at Earth Geocenter. Again, as best we could determine that circa mid-1980s. World Geodetic System 1984, done internally by the U.S. Defense Department, the U.S. Defense Mapping Agency, now the National Geospatial Intelligence Agency. I've already showed you the publication. They used no triangulation and no VLBI, but they did use almost 1,600 transit Doppler stations around the world to help define it. So the point I want to make here is that both datums, NAD83 and WGS84, in their original definitions, used no GPS. GPS was not a function of the definition of the original datums. And that's important. That comes along just a few years later. So in looking at this, remember I said if you have a datum, then you have to have a realization. Well, let's look at that. For NAD83, North American datum 1983, there's over 100,000 GPS passive and active control stations. Passive stations, a survey mark in the ground in brass marker in concrete or in bedrock or any number of different formations, or continuously operating reference stations. The National Geodetic Survey provides over 100,000 of these with positional accuracies relative to one another in the range of 1 to 5 centimeters. So there's a very large amount of accessibility to NAD83 at very high levels of positional integrity. So when you report that you have a position in NAD83 at 1 centimeter or 2 or 3 or 5 centimeters, that's easily definable within the context of the passive or active control stations. On the other hand, the realization of WGS84 by the Defense Department is none of this. There are no terrestrial control stations available on a website like NGS has that's publicly available for access. The only way you truly access WGS84 is purely from the satellites. There are no cores, there are no continuously operating reference stations that are available to those of us in the public. They're certainly available to some in the military, but not in the public sector. So from positions purely from GPS, now I'm left with point positioning accuracies. That is, if I take my GNSS receiver, and I don't care if it's the big bucks dual frequency receivers, you go out, you punch on, and all you're getting is information from the satellites, not related to anything on the ground. Now you are in WGS84 because that's what's being broadcast by the satellite, by the GPS satellites. And your uncertainty at any given point in time can easily be in the range of 2 to 7 meters as defined by the Federal Radio Navigation Plan, the Standard Positioning Service. There is no centimeter level positioning framework that you can now define for WGS84. The U.S. Defense Department does not provide that. So that's one aspect to look at. If you think you have high accuracy positioning in the range of a few centimeters, even 15 or 20 or 30 or 40 centimeters, you have to question what was the source of your data. Where did it come from? Did it come from the Defense Department? Probably not likely. That's very difficult to access, particularly for those of us on the civilian side. So very quickly, I'll give you a little historical background here. Both datums, as I mentioned previously, were defined by the transit Doppler. Here you see a picture of the Doppler satellites. The first one was launched in 1959. Regrettably, it did not achieve orbit. But by 1964, it had become operational within the context of the US military. So it was the first really significant. There had been other geodetic positioning satellite systems that were up there, but it was the first system that was truly operational on a global level, and primarily for military applications. It was released, or it was opened to the public in 1967, and almost immediately achieved a great response, because now you could use satellite positioning. I didn't need line of sight. All I need is to be able to access a signal from a satellite. So it became exceedingly popular to use in places like offshore oil and gas exploration, or in places like the Bureau of Land Management working up in Alaska. They used it extensively because there was very little control in some of these areas. But the bottom line was, no matter how long you sat on a point, and you sat there for days, not minutes or even seconds like is often done today with GNSS observations, you had to sit there for days at a time. And your positional integrity was going to be no better than about 1 meter horizontal and in the ellipsoid height. So it was a foundation from which the United States created GPS. And much of the original definition of both NAD83 and WGS84 was founded on the use of the transit Doppler system. Of course, GPS comes along. It was first launched in '78 but it hadn't really been operational till about the early '80s. The National Geodetic Survey performed the first practical geodetic survey anywhere in the world. 1982, 1983, Summit County, Ohio. But even that had to be put on hold while we were doing the transition to NAD83, because there was just so much data that was already being analyzed. I put a couple of highlights in here that I just want to point to for some definition. Next year, it says next launch of a Block 3 satellite will be in the fall of 2021. Well, here we are already in the fall of 2021, and that hasn't happened, so I suspect that'll be pushed to 2022 at the earliest. But what we're anticipating is that by late 2023, we will have a complete constellation of Block 3 satellites, which will vastly improve standard positioning capability in the United States, anywhere literally, not just the United States. So we're on the verge of some dramatic changes in positioning that it's going to be important to understand these distinctions between our national datum and the datum that's provided by GPS. Now, that being said, I want to take a look at the fact that we really no longer say global positioning system. We say global navigation satellite systems. There are 4 constellations providing us positioning and timing. The US Navstar GPS, the Russian GLONASS, the Galileo from the European Union, and Beidou from China. Each one of those systems operates in their own coordinate framework. So WGS84 is unique to the US Navstar Global Positioning System. If you go to the Russians, their system is called PZ90. You go to Galileo, it's the Galileo Terrestrial Reference Frame. You go to the Chinese, it's the Chinese Geodetic Reference Frame. So when users are starting to access multi-constellational information and yet reporting their coordinates as WGS84, it begs the question, well, how do you integrate all of these different satellite systems into that one singular coordinate system that's only for the US, when you're not realizing anything on the ground? That is, you have no cores that's managing all of this data on a usable basis. So that provides a foundation for confusion as well. If we look at this issue of WGS84, here's the documentation that is most current from the US Defense Department, from the National Geospatial Intelligence Agency. I've given you a link to this previously. And if you look at this document, which regrettably not many people ever have, right? It's the most up-to-date definition of WGS84. If you go to table 2.1, if you download this as a PDF on page 15, you will find the coordinate updates that the Defense Department has published over the years. And while they've done a tremendous job of keeping WGS84 highly accurate within the context of what they do, they have not really marketed the fact that WGS84 has gone through a number of changes. So when users will come to me and say, I have some coordinates that are in WGS84, and I'd like to transform them or get them over to, let's say, NAD83, okay. Certainly the first question I would ask is, which WGS84 do you have? And invariably, that's a deer in the headlights. Almost nobody's ever even seen this, unless you happen to be one of those of us involved in the geodetic community. Very, very, very few people who are involved in putting together databases of geospatial information and labeling it WGS84 have ever seen or know anything about the different iterations. And if we're going to say that our coordinate information is in the range of a few centimeters, it's absolutely critical that you link, that you provide the metadata for which reference frame is being used. So for example, here we see the definitions that the US Defense Department's had. The first one was just called WGS84. And then they've gone through this iteration, WGS84 G730, with respect to the International Terrestrial Reference Frame of 1992. That was their first change, which goes back to 1994. The G stands for GPS week, in which the new definition was defined. And you can see all the iterations that they've had. The most current, and it's not listed in this publication because the publication dates back to 2014, but just earlier this year, January of 2021, the US Defense Department released a new realization, WGS84 G2139, with respect to what is the most current realization of the International Terrestrial Reference Frame, which is ITRF 14. So if you're going to say, I have coordinates that are of high accuracy and they're in WGS84, then you must define which one of these reference frames it was defined in. And that can be vitally important. And if you don't have that, it can be very, very difficult to ultimately provide any transformations back and forth to other coordinate systems. So if you're not familiar with this International Terrestrial Reference Frame, just for a moment here, I call it the International Gold Standard because that's pretty much what it is. There's an office, the International Earth Rotation and Reference System Service. They're headquartered in Paris, France. And what they do is they collaborate with institutions around the world to collect various measurement system data and define our Earth orientation parameters. So some of those parameters could be, where is Earth Geocenter? That's one of our Earth orientation parameters. How does the Earth wobble on its axis? What is the dimension of that? Looking at plate tectonic velocities. These are parts of our plate orientation parameters. And they are not done by any one country. They're done by an institution, an independent institution of scientists who collaborate data, like I said, from around the world. And the first they did was in 1988. The most current is ITRF 14. And they're working on a new one, ITRF 20, which had hoped to be out later this year, 2021. That will not likely happen until at least mid to late 2022 at this point. So here you see pictures of the 4 different types of measurement systems, and I'm not going to spend a lot of time on them other than to note how they integrate with one another. GNSS, the vast majority of users who are in the GNSS world, the use of GPS and the other 4 constellations are working around GNSS stations. So here you happen to see one particular CORS, a continuously operating reference station. International VLBI, Very Long Baseline Interferometry. These are radio telescopes that when combining data together from different observations around the world can give us literally millimeter accuracy over transcontinental scales. Satellite laser ranging, and another one called DORIS, Doppler orbitography and radio positioning integrated on satellites. All of these measurement systems are combined together by the IERS to define a particular year's ITRF, and that happens now about every 5 to 6 or 7 years, because the network of this is growing quite large across the world. So when we talk about the relationship of knowing Earth Geocenter, for example, and I mentioned NAD83 is still fixed to our original definition, I can easily show that by picking up some data from a continuously operating reference station. Now what you're seeing here in Olathe, Kansas, this particular station, ZKC1, that is a CORS, a continuously operating reference station. It is not maintained by the National Geodetic Survey, but they compute the coordinates for it. They publish both the ITRF, which you can now consider to be WGS84 because the Defense Department has said, okay, they're identical out at the range of about 1 to 2 centimeters. And the NAD83, so if I look at the change in X, Y, and Z Earth-centered, Earth-fixed coordinates, it's quite easy for me to show that right here in Kansas, that the offset between our best knowledge of Earth Geocenter, which is the ITRF, and our national datum, NAD83, is about 1.5 meters, knocking on the door of 1.6 meters. And you can see here's estimates for the rest of the country. So if I'm actually defining a coordinate in NAD83, and I could actually define a coordinate in WGS84, then the positional differences between them would easily be in this range. So that's where you can't say that they are identical at all. So I highlight this part. Now there's a whole other presentation on datum transformation, so I'm not going to dwell on this one too much, other than to say when people will comment that NAD83 and WGS84 they're the same, that often comes from the original public, in fact even the most up-to-date publication from the US Defense Department, the one I just recently showed you, 2014, provides these datum transformations. The transformations were originally computed in 1987, and even with all the changes in positioning integrity that have occurred well over the last 30+ years, these values have never been changed by the Defense Department. So when you look at much of the GNSS equipment that's out there or the GIS software, and you're looking for this relationship between NAD83 and WGS84, you will almost always find 0, 0, 0, X, Y, and Z, meaning the values are identical, which they are not. Because as you see here, it says, oh yeah, it's 0 plus or minus 2 meters, 0 plus or minus 2 meters, 0 plus or minus 2 meters, which unfortunately, those plus or minus 2 meters never appear in the transformation tools that you're using. So again, I'd highly recommend you watch the datum transformation presentation that we've given as well. Today, based on from the National Geodetic Survey, ITRF to NAD83, which you could now consider to be WGS84 to NAD83, here are at least the 3 parameter differences. And you can see they're not 0, but they all fall within that 2 meter range. So again, the datums are different by about 2 meters, but they're not, they are certainly not 0. There is a utility that you can use. Again, I highlight this in the transformation presentation that we've done. It's called HTDP, and it can easily transform between NAD83 and WGS84. Here you see the most current realization that the National Geodetic Survey has used, along with ITRF. So if you do think you have coordinates and you want to transform them back and forth, this is the tool you're going to want to use. So go look at what I've said about it in the transformation presentation. So this is kind of the bottom line. My software, what's coming out of my computer when I'm positioning, it says I'm working in WGS84 because the overwhelming majority of GNSS manufacturers, when they generate their software, they say all the coordinates are in WGS84. Well, unless you are doing autonomous positioning, that is, you set up your receiver, you're getting information just from the satellites, you're not getting other information from ground control stations, then you're going to be at the standard positioning service, which is at the 95% confidence level, it could be upwards of 7 meters. Or unless you have data that's tied to control information from the Defense Department, and you see my point, good luck. They don't have a big website where they distribute data. You literally have to go to them, and they're not terribly forthcoming about providing data. You can use ITRF coordinates and then call them WGS84. So that's one thing you can do. If you have a client, or maybe you're working for the Defense Department, and they say we must have WGS84, then because the Defense Department has already said WGS84 and ITRF are aligned with one another, you can now say, oh, I'm going to use some ITRF coordinates from, let's say, a CORS that's published by the National Geodetic Survey, but I'm going to call it WGS84, and in this case, it would be the most current epoch, G2136. So, as it says, you're really in the reference frame of whatever the control points are that you're using. And over the multitudes of conversations that I've had with people who say they have WGS84 coordinates, what I have most often found is that they were actually using, at least in the United States, they were actually using NAD83 control, but because their software said it was WGS84, that's what they put out there. Now you want to make sure that if that's what's happening, you're labeling your data correctly, because you don't want to add a transformation to something that doesn't need it. So that's an important aspect for you to look into. Is there an easy way in which you could get accurate WGS84 coordinates? And yeah, I think there is, if you really need to have that. If you have a client that's demanding that you provide WGS84, there are several utilities. I'm just going to highlight 2 of them. One, if you have a dual frequency receiver, GNSS receiver, you can use the NGS utility Opus, the online positioning user service, and I've given you the URL. There, you submit your GPS, your dual frequency GPS data. It will report back to you in a few minutes. It will give you the NAD83 position. It will also give you the currently ITRF 14 position. And you simply change that. You change the definition of the ITRF to be WGS84, because as I pointed out, the Defense Department has said that's the way the system is defined. Or you could just as easily, if you're someplace else in the world, you can use Opus any place in the world, but you can also use Geosciences Australia's AusPos. It's a wonderful tool. The 2 of them are great companions. So you can literally go anywhere. Both of them will give you ITRF coordinates, and then you could simply change the ITRF values to be WGS84 2169 at the epoch of whatever the date of the coordinates are that you've determined. So yeah, there is an easy way in which you can go do this, but you have to be mindful of exactly what you're attempting to do here. So here's kind of the bottom line. So if I have WGS84 coordinates, if that's what's in my database, then what should I really be publishing? Well, here are the numerous iterations, and for each one of those, if you have data that's been collected, let's say somewhere back between 94 and 97, and you think it's at the couple of centimeter level, then you would have to define it as WGS84 G730 plus the epoch of the observation. And if you don't really understand what the epoch is, that's pretty simple. You go over here, it's the decimal portion of the year. So today, in fact, is November 8th, 2021. That's simply the decimal part of the year. So it's the epoch for today would be 2021.855. In addition, if you are saying you have WGS84 coordinates, you should never, at least in the United States, never ever combine them with geoid models that have been produced by the National Geodetic Survey to support the North American vertical datum of 1988. If you really need to have orthometric heights in WGS84, you should be using one of the geoid models, EGM84, 96, or 08, that are provided by the US Defense Department. So that's a very important aspect of using WGS84 as well. So kind of bringing this all around, a really important part of any of this geospatial information. And it's vitally important in determining the relationship of NAD83 and WGS84, but it should be part of any set of geospatial information that you as a user or company is collecting. You should follow this. As it says, coordinates and heights without the appropriate metadata have the same integrity as a boundary line in Google Earth. Well, they're great approximations, but they're not very accurate. So it's just, well, as you see, it's just a guess. So what am I talking about with metadata? What's important to collect and maintain and publish? Well, the datum. Make sure you know what datum you're working on. And for the multitude of, for the datums now that have different iterations, that is, they've been improved as they go along, you need to include that as well. So NAD83, there's the original, 1986. Then there's 1995, which is the Harn here in Kansas. It could be a different date for a different state. 2007, which is a national adjustment. 2011, which is the most current at the epoch of 2010.0. Or maybe I'm in WGS84, G2139, at the epoch of, well, whatever date I perform my observations. I need to have that kind of information to define the origin of the coordinates. The units of measure. Well, we wish it would be meters, and unfortunately not going to happen anytime soon in the US. But US survey feet or international feet, we certainly have seen this in the production of state plane coordinates, although the US survey foot is going away with the publication of the new datums by the National Geodetic Survey in probably 2025 with the North American Terrestrial Reference Frame of 2022. So that'll go away, but it's important if you're publishing in feet, which foot is being used. The accuracy. How good is your data really? The number of digits to the right of the decimal point have nothing to do with accuracy. How good is it really? And when you say, oh, my data is good to 1 centimeter or 5 centimeters or whatever, it's also important, is that 1 sigma or 2 sigma, 68 or 95% confidence. So as professionals, if you're putting information out there, you should be able to provide the spatial integrity of everything that you're publishing, or putting into a database, putting on a plat, whatever platform it might find. So I'm going to give you, just ending up here, I want to give you a couple of examples of some bad metadata that I've encountered over the years. And these all come from geospatial professionals. All right? So one is a north arrow. So on a plat for a survey, almost always a north arrow is provided for orientation. Here you see a very nice north arrow, but the orientation is NAVD88. Well, that's a vertical datum. There's no way you can get north out of a vertical datum. That just happens. So the professional who put this together mislabeled what they're doing. It becomes very confusing. This one down here, a comment from a surveyor, benchmark, top of a concrete bound, that means a monument, elevation 73.68, well 73.68 what? Meters, feet, purchase, chains, poles, we don't know. GPS datum, well what does that mean? You know, I could guess it's something, but I don't know what it means. The surveyor thought it meant something, but it doesn't have any technical meaning. So that's bad metadata. I particularly like this one over here, the Supreme Court of the United States, the offshore boundary of the state of California. They show the, so these are points that are 3 miles offshore following the boundary of the United States and California. They're all shown as UTM coordinates out to the nearest millimeter. That's fine, perfectly logical. But somewhere in this document, it should say what the integrity of those millimeters are. And it doesn't. There's nothing in this document that says how good this data really is. Additionally, it says the datum is NAD83/WGS84, meaning they're the same. Well, they're not. I've just gone through this past demonstration to show you that they're different by at least about 1.5 meters. So that's incorrect. Which datum is it really in? In investigating this, when it was brought to my attention back in 2014, I was able to later find out that the origin of these coordinates, that is the agency, the federal agency, it was a federal government agency, had determined these coordinates using nautical charts at a scale of about 1 to 50,000, which means that the integrity of any position on those charts was in the range of 25 meters. That is not provided in here anywhere. All the user is left with is seeing stuff out to the millimeter, so you're assuming this is millimeter quality information when it just isn't. So this is examples of some bad metadata. And whatever data you have, talk to your professionals, talk to other people in professional societies. Get a sense of what's important for you to provide so that people will be able to understand your data 25, 30, 50, 100 years from now, 150 years from now, if you have the appropriate metadata about your positions and heights. That brings us to the end of the presentation on these datums. And I like to end all of mine with good coordination begins with good coordinates, and geography without geodesy is a felony. And again, our appreciation to the Florida Surveying and Mapping Society and the Geospatial Users Group for providing the foundation and support for these presentations. Thank you very much.